Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. In the Mobile User Acquisition Show, we talk about how to use mobile user acquisition strategies to grow your app quickly and capital efficiently. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is presented by me, Shamant Rao, mobile growth leader and founder and CEO of the mobile growth consulting firm Rocketship HQ. Each episode includes strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition that you can use to unlock tremendous growth for your app in a sustainable and capital efficient manner. Our guest today is Josh Burns, the founder of DigitalDevConnect. Josh founded DigitalDevConnect to partner with game developers, game publishers, and service providers to support key business areas including strategy, market intelligence, marketing, game publishing, business operations, product management, and business development. Josh's specialty is in advising game developers in helping them crack international markets, which is something we're going to dive into today in great depth. I'm very excited to welcome Josh Burns, the founder of DigitalDevConnect, to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Josh, I'm very excited to have you.
Awesome. Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for including me.
Indeed, indeed. I feel like we've crossed paths so often for many years, and you're certainly somebody who's held in so much regard by so many people I know, just because you've helped so many companies navigate and negotiate what can often appear to be somewhat murky, somewhat unclear, somewhat amorphous inside of the broad sort of ambit of what one might call international expansion, right? And you've really gone into the weeds. You've really understood and helped a lot of companies attempting to negotiate and navigate international expansion. And that's absolutely something I would love to dive into in much more depth and detail today with you. You know, Josh, to start off, what sort of developers is international expansion even right for? Should everybody be looking at it? How do you recommend developers start thinking about it or evaluating this at all?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I think, for every, focusing on gaming vertical, I think, everyone can do something. I think it's really about the right timing. I think one of the things I see companies do of all sizes is try to think about, all the different markets in the world when they're building their game and are trying to make a game that will, resonate everywhere, which is, I think, in my perspective, sort of impossible to do. I think in the end, there are some games that do resonate globally, but that wasn't never the intention. My feedback is always, focus on building a game for the audience that you understand best. If that's your local market or a specific, user that enjoys a certain type of gameplay, like focus on that, get that working really well. And then you can sort of start to think about how do you kind of expand internationally. But if your game isn't essentially working in your sort of core demographic or market of focus, like it's never going to be successful, as you look to other markets that you are less kind of aware of and understanding. It's not suddenly magically going to perform better there or generate, better returns.
Yeah, it sounds like it makes sense if there's a core game in a core market that's doing well, because you obviously don't want to scale something that's not optimal or not working efficiently in the core markets, right? And and again, when you start thinking about going international, would it make sense to just do Facebook ads in all markets, or Google ads, Google Snap, the big ad networks in global markets, and just scaling the hell out of these? Is that enough for the vast majority of people? How do you recommend thinking about a plug and play approach to internationalization?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like, we'll talk about some of the due diligence process in a little bit, but I think, basically, if you think of, obviously we're talking a very broad spectrum of developers who have different resources and capabilities. for the smaller developer, the best, and most accessible first step and maybe only step is, translate the game, make sure it's for markets where they don't speak English or whatever your main primary language is, make sure it's localized and localizing the app store pages. To me, that's kind of like the sort of entry point to really like test what the potential is in these markets. And then, when you're looking at maybe a developer with more resources with, capabilities to do marketing or scaling their game through performance marketing, I think, people, I a lot of times see people kind of like overcomplicate things. So they think, oh, I'm gonna, take my game to these, markets, Japan or Korea or these, international markets. I need to figure out like how do people market games there? What are they doing? Like some local performance channels or even other, types of marketing activities. But the reality is, I think the initial step should always be, leveraging what you already understand and are good at. So if you're, focused on North America and Western Europe, and you're using, Facebook, Google, Snap, Unity, Vungle, App11, etc. All the stuff that's super familiar. You have relationships there that's self-serve. You understand how to run campaigns. All of those, all of those channels are generally going to have inventory in these countries. And so, that's your starting point, right? Like start running campaigns there. If it's even using the same creatives and, localizing them, in my perspective, until you saturate those channels, which like realistically 95% of developers never will, gaming developers, just because of their scale and stuff like this. These companies have huge amount of impressions and inventory in these countries. Until you reach that point, like after that, I think you don't need to, focus on these local channels. In my experience, like in these markets, a lot of these local networks, not self-serve, super, have huge high minimum budgets. They're operating more like traditional kind of, like marketing sources where you have, you have to talk to someone and it's all, so it can be like incredibly time consuming. And, in the end, it might be a waste of time anyway, even to try and test these things. So, my perspective, bottom line is like, if you want to explore performance in these foreign markets, like almost everywhere, with some exceptions, like all the stuff that you're, all the channels and partners that you're working with now will be able to make very meaningful inroads in those markets.
Gotcha. So it sounds like the lowest hanging fruit are always the international scale channels. And let's assume a developer wants to take things to the next level and they really want to localize, culturalize the game, because just localizing the marketing, just targeting the marketing is only going to take them so far, right? Let's assume they want to take things to the next level. And then they essentially look at the world, and each Asian market is so very different. Culturally, of course, also in terms of monetization potential, purchasing power as well, right?
Yeah.
And you couldn't just say, let's go international and just run one single campaign or just work with one single partner, right? So presumably each market requires very different approaches, very different strategies. Also because just the revenue size in some of these markets is so humongous.
Yep.
So let's assume there's a developer with a single game. They've tested sort of the big marketing channels. They're like, right, we think there's strong LTV, strong ROAS is here from the big marketing channels. We really want to localize. Where do you think they should start in terms of evaluating any of the 200 countries they could be localizing for? Assuming, the answer is probably going to differ by genre and game, but typically, how do you recommend they start thinking about this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first part is really just to do more research on the different markets. So, I think, you can obviously likely your game, there's similar similar games out there on the market.
Yeah.
So looking into the key markets, so you could say start with the top, countries by revenue. So, in there you have Japan, South Korea, China, are in there, which are all very different and very, very complex. But from there, you can go in and look like, if I have a word game, probably not a lot of opportunity. If I have a, RPG game, maybe there's opportunity, but it's also very competitive. But I think just, looking at the charts, seeing what other games what genres are doing that are similar to your game, are they, ranking into the top charts in terms of grossing, even super far down, in the top 200, 300 grossing. That gives you at least some directional information to say like, okay, well, I can narrow these down to, I can start from 10 and narrow down to, five countries, because all of these countries have different complexities between them that impact the game. So, you have very developed countries like Japan and Korea, and then you have, region like Southeast Asia where, games like Fortnite or whatever, which are very popular, most people's, low-end Android phones, you can't even play the game. Or maybe your game has like a huge download size. It's I don't know,
Yeah.
800 megabytes, and people have a limited data. They're not going to download that.
Yeah.
And then there's payment issues, network constraints. There's another thing to look at is sort of the general interest in sort of, let's call them foreign games. If you're in the market, for us that would be our content. So if you look at markets like in Southeast Asia, like Singapore, Philippines, like a lot of Western games are very popular. Whereas you look at Japan, especially is you basically have all local games from local companies
Yeah.
that pretty much dominate. So, this is kind of stuff that there's a lot of information available online from different, companies using the App Store intelligence rankings. And just, some of them, even market intelligence companies publish a lot of data around what are the biggest countries. And then just,
Right.
using that to help kind of narrow down the pool of all the countries to, ones that you think would be the most relevant.
Yeah.
And then I think from there, it's really like starting with basic stuff. Like I said, even the smallest developer, can likely localize their game and then localize their app store page, and you're going to get some organic traffic. Maybe it's very
Yeah.
small, and let's see how that performs, right? Like,
Yeah.
does on a per user basis, is it
Yeah.
compelling? Does it compare with what you're seeing
Yeah.
in your core market? So that's I think it will help prioritize, but like you said, it's going to be different for everyone based on the type of game they have as well as
Yeah.
their scale and resources.
Yeah. And that makes sense because there's so much competitive intelligence already out there. Even if you don't subscribe to a lot of these tools, just look at the app stores, see who's doing well, look at the revenue potential. Certainly makes sense to zero in on the top couple of markets, see what the app store charts look like, and go from there to see what the biggest opportunities could be. Right. And of course, speaking of opportunities, I understand China is a completely beast altogether. And this is funny. I was reading this article. Basically, they had this stack of like 100-page sort of documentation. They're like, this is our iOS submission to the regulatory authorities about why we should be allowed to operate in China. I don't know if that's still the process to get approved, but I'm curious, what's in
Yeah.
this like 100-page stack, 200-page stack, and why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think China on itself is kind of, it's always been very complicated and only has become much worse in terms of complexity. If you look at the top grossing games, you look at the top public companies in mobile gaming, most of them do nothing in China because it's just too complicated to deal with. Even though it's the biggest market in the world, they just don't want to deal with the hassle. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, in terms of the process, basically, in the last couple of years, the government basically said that every game that is released in China needs to have ISBN, which is essentially a license code, a license to be live. So as part of that process revision, in the recent past, basically the amount of information that you have to submit is quite significant. So the one side is like the volume of information is very high. So even printing out the source code of your game
Wow.
has to be into
Okay.
paper, and that's why these these huge stacks of papers. But basically like you have to have an overview of like the tutorial and like what's the first user experience, and early on you actually had to like load the game onto a phone and like put it in the with your submission, like the
Oh,
game
okay.
on the actual device.
Okay.
So so the process itself is like almost humorously complex. But the other
Yeah.
side that makes it even more of a challenge is like for a while there's like different governing entities that like had were sort of fighting to like control the process, and the process was very fluid. So you're kind of like, it wasn't even clear what information you're supposed to submit, and it was like always changing. That's like stabilized more,
Yeah.
but the reality is it's very time consuming, and what that means is that it essentially increases the barrier of entry, right?
Yeah.
Like you from 2 3 perspectives. Actually, one, you have to go through the process, you submit everything, they review it, they're like, no, this, there's still an English word in here, you
Oh,
can't have any
wow.
English words.
Okay.
Or, oh, there's a skeleton that's like taboo, you can't have that. Or this is real blood or something. So then it's like back and forth, process that just takes forever, and then you're waiting to go in the process. For a foreign developer, the other complexity is that you can't actually even participate in this process. So
Okay.
the only companies that can actually submit a game are local Chinese companies.
Okay.
So if you're not like I think it's like majority owned by Chinese citizens, or you're not a majority Chinese entity, you can't even participate in this process.
Okay.
And then the other one is basically for a long time it was frozen, and that was for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, so that actually hurt a lot of sort of smaller companies in China who were building games for Chinese audience, because they had no way to release their games, and so they actually started focusing a lot on the foreign
Wow.
markets.
Okay.
The bottom line is like the process
Yeah.
is time consuming, the process is
Yeah.
complicated, but you can't even participate in it anyway.
Yeah.
You have to work with a partner. So and then the thing I think we'll touch on this that was announced recently is basically, so there was a requirement, but basically the iOS store and Steam from the PC game side, it was a gray area where it wasn't enforced. So it was still a place where you could release your games. Anyone could release games that were available to Chinese audience that didn't have to, like, they were supposed to have the code, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And for iOS, this is something that's supposedly changing starting July 1st. So
Okay.
it's been talked about a little bit, but to me, I think it actually could be, it's actually could be a huge problem for a lot of companies in the middle tier.
Yeah.
Because like I said, at the top tier, they are too risk averse to release their game in China because they're a public company. They don't, or
Yeah.
they're like very visible. But if you're kind of in the, I don't know, top 100 to 300 grossing, like China might be 10, 5, 10, 15, 20% of your revenue.
Yeah.
And theoretically, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. That disappears overnight.
Yeah.
So people are trying to figure out, is it only going to be for new games? Is it going to be for everyone? What's the
Sure.
process? Is like you wake up and your
Sure.
game's gone. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, so that sounds like a very Byzantine process, right? And it's crazy that you had to print out your source code. But something I want to ask about is, you said the only way to make it work is to have a local partner, and I know quite a few Chinese companies have invested in Western games. Tencent, Fisher comes to mind, right? But so does it? If you have to find a partner, is it like a traditional model of a publishing deal where you just sort of have a deal, they do the submissions, they take a rev share from whatever they do in China? Is that typically how it works?
Yeah. So historically, if we think about kind of the Chinese publisher model for mobile game, It's usually based on like a revenue share. Usually
Okay.
there's, some type of minimum guarantee where they essentially pay you some amount upfront that they recoup from.
Okay.
Um, and then early on, like they would basically take the source code of the game and do all the work. So they would take the source code,
Right.
make some changes, make it more appealing to Chinese audience. Maybe they change the in-app purchase price points. Maybe they add some local content that's
Yeah.
interesting. Then they push it out into the Android channels. They push it out on iOS and do marketing, different types of marketing. So that was early on. I think over time, companies that's a lot of work. So
Yeah.
companies, some shifted to more of like a focus on just the distribution. So they've
Right.
pushed on the developer to like make some changes and maybe integrate some of the SDKs to these Android stores, and the partner would focus on the promotion part because that's means it'll be a little bit less
Right.
risky for them.
Right.
So I think one thing that's unknown is kind of this. I'm a developer. I have a game that's live since 2016 on iOS, and it's making I don't know a few $1 million a year in China. But now I need the ISBN code. I need to work with somebody there. I don't really need them to do anything besides secure this code,
Yeah.
but I need them. I need someone to do that. So I don't know what that model will be like. I think
Yeah.
I've seen, this licensing thing has been around for a while, but never was really of concern. People were doing some sort of more like
Sure.
service model where it's kind of like a monthly fee and this kind of thing. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I know a lot of the companies there are suddenly more interested in working with Western companies because they know that the Western companies are going to be forced to work with them, and there's plenty of games making a lot of money that will need their help. So those are the kind of the models that exist right now.
Sure.
I think the one thing I will say is that over time, the number of companies interested in publishing foreign games in China has declined
Okay.
because the market has become more competitive. The complexity of releasing any game has gone up. You added this once you threw in this sort of the market was always competitive. Then you throw in this like crazy regulatory process.
Yeah.
The bar has just increased for those that still want these games because there's just the minimum effort is so high now to even release
Yeah.
any game. So
Crazy.
they're very particular versus say 3 to 4 years ago, kind of there's all these different companies and everyone was kind of every game would find someone to work with and launch out. So that's one of the challenges right now as I work with help different sort of foreign companies is there's everyone's still looking and stuff like this, but the level of the rigor is incredibly high just
Yeah.
based on the level of effort at a very minimum to release a game in China.
Wow. Yeah. And out of curiosity, and maybe this is more about geopolitics than game development. Why do you think they make it so hard? Is it that they just want to favor local developers? Is it just bureaucratic ineptness? What do you think it is?
Um, I think, there's definitely some sort of political motivation. Obviously, censorship is a huge thing.
Right.
I mean, so there's sort of different aspects. I think the bureaucracy was added just this additional level of complexity where there's sort of different groups sort of jockeying over who was going to
Sure.
control the process.
Yeah.
That just added complexity because no one was really sure what was happening. The censorship has always been a huge thing. And frankly, that's probably one of the large drivers is basically making sure that the content is appropriate. I think, people isn't necessarily like a foreign developers caused the problem necessarily. There's
Right.
people building games in market in China that were like had like gambling elements, which
Right.
aren't allowed, and they weren't like social casino games, but they effectively were with just some sort of like more accessible looking front end, but they're basically gambling games.
Yeah.
Some like inappropriate content, but it's really just like controlling that. I think yeah, I mean, I think there is some, sort of favoritism to local companies, but the reality is, like I talked about, is not necessary. Even when they shut down the process, even if you were Tencent, like you couldn't release any games. So
Right.
there wasn't sort of like a backdoor sort of loophole where, oh, I'm so and so, I'm going to get through. And it was actually like debilitating to the sort of middle and long tail developers, right? Because they were
Yeah.
essentially unable to release any games. So,
Wow.
and these are Chinese companies. So,
Yeah.
I don't think it was totally motivated to sort of, but there is some like, if you look at the games that are approved now, there's tensions with Korea, and there hasn't been a Korean game approved in the last couple of years.
Oh,
And
wow.
obviously, Korea has like hugely popular, games that would be hugely popular in China, but there's that aspect too. I think some people are, well, anyway, yeah, I mean, people look at it as, well, like, why doesn't the US do something with, for, because
Yeah.
like I say, what happened is all the games are like, screw China.
Yeah.
We're in China, like, we're going to go focus on US
Yeah.
because it's like open season and there's not like
Yeah.
a lot of requirements. So
Yeah.
those are some of the factors, but
Sure.
it's very complex.
Sure. No, this is, I think, helpful for a lot of people listening, because when they encounter a lot of these hurdles, I think sometimes the answer for them is maybe this requires a diplomatic solution at like the White House level, and not at,
Yeah.
talking to Tencent,
Yeah.
or yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
no, I'm actually surprised that this iOS loophole has been open for so long,
yeah,
frankly,
yeah,
because of the level of rigor they've had on the Android side and stuff like this.
sure,
So it's not surprising to me that it happened. But like all these things we just talked about, this is why if I'm, Zynga or Glue, and like the reality is maybe a lot of their games aren't relevant to Chinese audience. Like they don't even bother. Like if you look at a lot of the public companies, they're just like, no, it's not even EA. They for the most part, they don't even bother with these markets because
yeah,
there's so much sort of like downside risk and then
yeah,
also complexity
yeah,
that it's always something they just like sort of steered clear of.
yeah, 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 yeah. And of course, we haven't yet talked about Android, which again is a completely different sort of labyrinth in and of itself. So I understand there are like dozens of Android stores. And again, to the best of my understanding, you had to go to these with local partners just as well. So
Yeah.
do you have the exact same sort of regulation? What are some of the key hurdles if you have to get an Android game out in China? How does that differ from what you talked about with iOS?
Yeah, so it's the licensing part is basically the same. So your license is sort of for the game, and that can be leveraged then on any platform. So Android, the licensing requirements have been in place for a long time. There was a couple kind of Android channels that sort of flouted these requirements, and then they got the crackdown from the government. They had like sanctions where they were sort of shut down from generating revenue for a while. So
Yeah,
on Android, effectively, you've had to have the license code forever, or not forever, excuse me, for the last few years. And again, that means you have to work with a local partner if you're a foreign company. The good news on the Android side is like if you talk about it like 3 or 4 years ago, there was people would always say, "Oh, there's hundreds of Android channels," this kind of stuff. The only good news is like there's been a lot of consolidation. So a lot of the even bigger ones have consolidated together, and a lot of the sort of mid to long tail ones are not really relevant. So
yeah,
from a complexity side, it's more manageable. It's still a huge pain, and that's why frankly you work with a local partner. Each of these channels has a different SDK. There's no English documentation.
right,
The documentation is not very great, is not very good anyway. And so a lot of these publishers have technology where you essentially in layman's terms like insert the binary and it spits out like the 20 40 different versions you need, because when you're
yeah,
updating the app, obviously you need one for each of the stores, so it spits it all
right,
out and sort of
right,
like handles a lot of that process.
right,
The other key from the partner side is we think of like Google Play and Apple. They're kind of the reality is, yeah, sure, a lot of the biggest games get featuring because they have high profile stuff. But they do give a lot of visibility to like smaller developers,
Yeah.
and things like this. On the Android side in China, it's very business driven in terms of visibility. So
Yeah.
basically, like you want to work with that partner, because the partner's gonna be able to go to the Android China and be like, hey, they have a track record. They bring games that generate revenue, and that's not, for the most part, historically, what they focus on is like, I'm going to give you visibility in my Android channel because you're going to generate me revenue.
Right.
And so if you're coming from this, it's kind of that kind of focus. It's less sort of your curation and this kind of stuff. So that's why you really need, the partner as well to navigate it. So there's kind of the operational part as well as the sort of relationship part that's key for the Android side.
Yeah. And when you talk about having a local partner, let's assume there's a sort of a mid-tier developer who wants to find a partner.
Mm-hmm.
Should they fly into Shanghai? Or should they sort of send emails to business development folks? Should they talk to somebody like where do they begin?
Yeah. So great question. This sort of, I don't know, say irony of this question is like, a lot of my work is helping people navigate this process, both based on, just knowing the right people and knowing who's going to. The reality is like for 80% of maybe even more of developers, like there's not really many opportunities for you, and you should actually just do stuff on your own. Well, I guess that's what I would have told you before July 1st. I would have just said like, look, for China, just localize your game into simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese for like to cover like Taiwan and Hong Kong. Get it on iOS, localize the App Store, call it a day, right? Do some, you can do UA on iOS, through different methods. But from a publisher perspective, the harsh reality is, like I said, the bar is very high. There's just not going to be a lot of opportunities for folks. And what I see is that people do a lot of things is they, hold back their game from being available in China on iOS because they think they're going to, work with Tencent or NetEase or something. And then they miss the opportunity where, their game's new. They actually do feature a lot of Western games on iOS in China. Or they have these sort of like pipe dream kind of ideas, and the reality is there's not huge opportunity for them. So this would have been what I would say up until July. We'll see what happens, but basically I just kind of like you should just, for majority of folks, you should just release the game, push it live on iOS in China, and do the minimal you can. For those that are operating at a larger scale, have very high potential products, and there are folks looking for indie games that want to bring different things to China, even premium games. The opportunity is not huge. The reality is a lot of these folks are at the events. They're coming to the Western market. You can find a lot online in terms of different companies and reach out to them. They're very responsive. Well, they're generally like pretty responsive. But I think the key takeaway is just, having a realistic sort of perspective on the potential of your game in China. Because people are like, oh, China, it's the biggest market in the world. Like, I'm going to hold back and do all these complicated things and talk to like Tencent and NetEase and whoever. And we're going to have this like crazy launch and do all this kind of stuff. And the reality is like, that's for like the 0.1% of games. So, it's not just the 0.1% that have opportunity to work at publisher, but it's just a small number of games. And unfortunately, I think the changes starting in July will kind of eliminate most of the opportunity. My hope is that there's some model that can be found that's in between like a publisher and self-publishing or doing nothing, where you can kind of get the license. And it's as frictionless as possible, and like you can get the game out and do something interesting. But that remains to be seen, honestly. So,
Yeah, yeah,
I'm always happy to like look at people's games and just give them this,
sure,
realistic feedback, like
sure.
about it. But yeah, I think the key is just, don't have great, be realistic about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the reality is there's not a lot of huge opportunity for working with partners for most people.
Interesting. Yeah, 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 yeah. And it's easy to lose sight of just looking at everything in China as a monolithic thing. Uh,
Yeah.
are, are there examples of games that have done this well that you can think of?
Um, yeah, I mean, most of the ones that have been like very successful have had like very deep partnerships.
Oh, yeah.
If you look at games like Subway Surfers, he was able to reach like a very large scale in China, but there was a ton of effort dedicated to, adding custom content and custom
Right, right,
events. Um, uh, you know, uh, so it's if you think about like Chinese mobile gaming, like early on, say in 2013 and 14, like most of the very popular games were Western games because there wasn't a ton of like innovation or anything really interesting being developed in China. So that was like kind of the heyday of this sort of like cross border publishing, is like the Fruit Ninja, um, Cut the Rope, like Subway Surfers, these kind of things, which got to like massive scale. Um, that nowadays that's like pretty difficult. You see it with maybe some of the Supercell games, which have managed to be very successful. But you know, otherwise these days it's very difficult, and that's why I think the publishers are more cautious. I'm encouraging people to kind of just like take a very like methodical approach to trying to do what they can. If you do the localization of the game in the app store, you can do some local marketing. Maybe you can hire a person that can be engaged with a community of Chinese players. It's on WeChat and answering questions. Then we can add some custom content for Chinese New Year. So it's like a slowly
yeah.
increasing complexity, and then you can hopefully grow the revenues and stuff of your game. Again, this is before the sort of July 1st kind of situation. So
Yeah.
that's kind of where things are at. A lot of these games, if you look at the top grossing charts in China on iOS, you don't see very many non-Chinese games, let alone like
Right.
non-Asian games.
Yeah.
And that just speaks to the challenge of the market, that's
Yeah.
dominated by the Tencent, the NetEase, and then some, and then the sort of other large players really like controlling the market. So
Yeah.
yeah, unfortunately, not a lot to point to recently that's
Yeah.
at the top end of the market opportunity.
Indeed. Indeed. Maybe I missed this. What happens on July 1st again?
June 30th is the date where basically after which you have to have the license to be on
Right.
iOS. Yeah.
Right. 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 Right.
So
Gotcha. Cool.
nobody knows exactly what happens on July 1st, which is the day after. Does like everything disappear? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
possible.
Okay.
If you look at like, you know, so if you look at say like Korea, and there's on iOS, there's the social casino category doesn't exist. Or if you
Right.
look at in Korea for social casino and Google Play, it's a bunch of like random local games because they have to be licensed. So you can kind of
Right.
see like what potentially it could look like, right?
Yeah.
Just all local stuff. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
We'll find out. We'll find out. Yes. I think this has been a great reality check, right? And I think the vast majority of people don't quite appreciate the complexity of exactly what it takes. And as you pointed out, this sort of expansion into China is really for the top 0.1%. Josh, this has been incredibly insightful, and even for myself, just because this is something I just barely knew sort of at a very surface level.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show and giving us the inside scoop on all things international, all things China specifically. Right. This was perhaps a good time to wrap, but as we
Sure.
wrap, could you tell our listeners how they can find out more about you and the work you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah, for sure. So you can go to my website, which we can share afterwards. It's DigitalDevConnect.com. Look me up on LinkedIn. You can, reach out to me through the website. Always happy to answer questions from anyone. Maybe it might take a while for me to get back to you, but I'm, always happy to provide feedback and kind of, love talking to people working on different cool stuff in gaming as well as, in other verticals as well. So, yeah, thanks for having me. And I hope people can learn a little bit about it. Always try to be, positive, but also realistic. Because I think what I see is you get somebody that's, a Chinese publisher and they're going to be like, oh, you have to come to China. It's the biggest market. And then, people like spin their wheels and waste a bunch of time where they could be, doing other things with that time and effort. So anyway.
Cool. Absolutely, awesome. Sir. Yeah. Thank you again for being on the show. Excited to put this out in the world very soon.
Cool. Thank you.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog. Thank you.